Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday Build. This is episode 1.27, and today we're going to be discussing the topic reducing friction, lessons learned from atomic habits for improving the user experience, featuring creating fire with your hands, as the picture shows here. My name is Brittany Hernandez. You can call me the beet emoji or bee or peanut or brittle as you like. My uncle and my dad like to call me by these nicknames. I'm from San Diego, California, but I live in London now. I previously served on active duty in the United States military as a boatswain's mate, second class petty officer in Puerto Rico and Alaska. After which I became a lawyer in intellectual property and entertainment law in California. I opened my own law practice, took on clients such as composers, directors, producers, helped them with their intellectual property matters. And I also founded Cormayam Kamai LLC, which stands for Where Knowledge Meets Application and Implementation, which really focuses on how we can take all of these various concepts that we learn throughout life and put them together in a usable format. Particularly these days around no-code and low-code development, how we can take what we learn and the skills that we gain and apply them to our businesses to scale up. I also have a master's degree in international film business. I worked as a business development executive, a Gavel expert, and I'm the global ambassador to law schools for Gavel, formerly Documate, under which I've held the role of program director and senior instructor of the Law Students in Legal Tech Access to Justice Fellowship. And I'm the founder, course creator, and senior instructor for Cormayam Academy, where we have Gavel certification courses, courses in software and Airtable and Go Full Page, and more. I'm also the creator and host of the Lightning Talks for Legal Innovators series in partnership with Gavel, as well as this series, the Wednesday Build. And I'm also the creator of a free interactive digital magazine called Code Word Hex, which comes out every Tuesday, and the creator and editor of the Tuesday Forecast newsletter. Finally, I'm the founder of Cormayam Retreats, where we have different high-achieving women and female founders from around the world gather together once a year in different places. This year, we're going to Lisbon, Portugal, and we're just going to connect with each other, learn from each other, and grow our businesses. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to be discussing the topic, reducing friction, lessons learned from atomic habits for improving the user experience, featuring creating fire with your hands. Now, the first thing is to understand this idea of what is friction. So when we're talking about friction, it's like that, the way that the wood is rubbing against the other pieces of wood when you're trying to create fire, when you're out camping and whatever else to create this heat and friction. Friction can be good in this sense that it's going to provide warmth. And even when you just rub your hands together, you start to generate energy between your hands and you can feel your hands warming up. And this idea of friction can also help us to have traction on the roads when it's icy or slick, and the way that the tires interact with the roads and so on. So there's many, many great uses for friction, but in some instances, friction can cause us as humans to behave in a way that we are actually deterred from taking a particular behavior because of the amount of friction, or in this case, we can also talk about resistance. So we want to talk about this in terms of how it relates to development when we're trying to develop a particular type of application or workflow using different tools. So this could be for somebody who is a coder, but also for people who are in the no-code development space, particularly with something like a Gavel, a software, an Airtable, something like that. So even Notion, for example. So anything where you're going to necessarily have like another person on the other side who's utilizing your application, this could come in handy for you. So when we talk about atomic habits, I'm specifically referring to a book by James Clear of that name. It's talking about how tiny changes in your life can lead to remarkable results. So the book itself is specifically talking about behavior change for you personally and how you can apply principles of cue, craving, response, and reward, these different rules of behavior change to improve your life 1% and get 1% better every day for massive gains and changes over a period of time. Also, kind of this idea of the compound effect at work and at play. So we can actually apply these principles in business, and he has a bonus chapter on how to apply atomic habits to business. But I think that even just the basic understanding that we have from cue, crave, response, and reward, just from the book itself, is applicable here. And I'm going to pull some quotes from the book to illustrate this point as well. The first of which is this idea around the law of least effort. So before we talk about this principle, I just want to talk about what is, when we're talking about like the user experience, what are we referring to? So that you can have this in mind as we go through. So the idea around a user experience relates to how we, as the developers of some system or some application, how the user experiences that, either from design as far as fonts and, kind of visually the colors, but also physically, like the flow of how they are going through the experience, meaning how much friction or resistance there is to certain behaviors. So how are they incentivized or incentivized to take particular actions throughout whatever process that you've created, and how you're drawing people's attention to certain elements of your application or workflow. So this is really fun for me to think about, because I love the idea of thinking about a little bit of human behavior and psychology and how we're interacting with the computer, or the way that this particular application is delivered to us, either through our mobile phones, our tablets, our computers, which is also a huge element of user experience and testing. So just to have it in your mind, we're talking about when you have created something for another human to interact with, where on their side, we want to think about what experience they're going through, even down to what are they feeling. Because let's say, for example, you have built a tool for survivors of domestic violence, which is a very serious, heavy topic that has a lot of emotion around this particular experience. So for someone who's in that position, they are probably very emotionally drained and exhausted. And I cannot even pretend to know what is going on in the mind of a person who's in that position. However, we can understand and empathize with somebody who's been through a very traumatic experience, and how we might want to make the experience a lot more warm. If you can inject warmth into this type of experience for them, where maybe you have a lot of help text, maybe you have somebody who is live on the chat bot and could even have a virtual call, be there on the screen live with them to walk them through the process so they don't get overwhelmed or re-traumatized. What types of questions we ask throughout the interview or workflow, so that we word them in a way that is very soft and kind and warm to their experience, that's not very depersonalized, or maybe in that particular scenario, we would want to use their name throughout the workflow and make it really, really personal, versus it being something like, what was the perpetrator's name? We could say, Sally, we understand that you're going through something really hard right now. It would be really useful for this process if you could give us a little bit of context about what happened in this area below. You can use your own words, whatever. So the approach to how language is designed, the approach to how the visual aspects of this is designed, the way that it's delivered and where it's delivered is also very important. So as we consider all of these different pieces, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the user experience. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the law of least effort. So this idea comes from the idea that the less energy a habit requires, the more likely it is to occur. So this is a little bit about incentives and incentives for action, and also around like human behavior and patience. So the kind of outcome that we're talking about here is that energy is precious, and the brain is wired to conserve it whenever possible. It is human nature to follow the law of least effort, which states that when deciding between two similar options, people will naturally gravitate toward the option that requires the least amount of work. So he gives this really interesting example in the book in chapter 12, on this idea of the law of least effort, which refers to Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a book by an anthropologist and biologist called Jared Diamond, who points out this kind of simple fact, which is that different continents have different shapes. And he talks about how this affects how agriculture was spread across the world. So it kind of talks about how when it was easy for people to kind of migrate laterally or horizontally versus north and south, it made it to where certain types of crops were spread across the nation in across the world in a certain pathway, because it was easier to go horizontally than it was to go north or south. So it's really interesting because he talks here, for example, the primary axis of the Americas run from north to south. That is, the landmass of North and South America tends to be tall and thin rather than wide and fat. The same is generally true for Africa. Meanwhile, the landmass that makes up Europe, Asia, and the Middle East is the opposite. The massive stretch of land tends to be more east-west in shape. So according to the anthropologist and biologist that we mentioned here, Jared Diamond, this difference in shape played a role in the spread of agriculture over the centuries. So he talks about how this kind of goes through and gives a map of what this looks like. So this orientation of being more north and south, as well as here, versus east and west orientation. So through that, you have agriculture spread nearly twice as fast across Europe and Asia as it did elsewhere. The behavior of farmers, even across hundreds or thousands of years, was constrained by the amount of friction in the environment. So was it, let me just close this really quick. So because it was colder, maybe up north versus south, but stayed relatively moderate across the board horizontally, there was less friction, which influenced human behavior. So that goes back to this idea that energy is precious, and we are, where's that quote about our minds? So our human nature is to follow this law of least effort, where just when deciding between these two options, people are going to naturally gravitate to the option that requires the least amount of work. And that's how, with that understanding, we can then go on to shape human behavior around putting more or less friction around behaviors that we desire somebody to take or we don't desire someone to take. And when you're building out different systems, particularly something like a workflow, for example, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second to pull up an account here. Let me just go ahead and pull up this example we can walk through together. So when we are talking about this in the context of building out legal products or building out just tools using, let's say, no code or coding options, we're thinking about this user experience as the director of someone's journey throughout this particular workflow, and we're guiding them along the way. And we have to be mindful, like I said, of what mental state that they're in, what their ability is to understand the terminology that we're using. So language is a huge part of this, adding more or less warmth depending on the situation and the situation that that particular person is in at the time that they're encountering this, how complex and how long something is, how long can we break something up that's really long into shorter pieces so that somebody can do this one at a time versus having to see this as this huge monumental thing that they need to do, how many sidebar sections there are so it doesn't look so daunting. So can we couple things together and only really focus on the most relevant bits so it looks and feels shorter? So I think that there's a lot of different pieces that we can talk about and go through as we think about a user's experience. Before we start to build something together and just sort of play with this idea a little bit more, I wanted to relate a story that is relevant in my life right now around my own user experience. And part of this comes from a conversation that I had with my upfront Bond 7 buddies. So I have a group of ladies who are part of the same confidence course that I'm going through right now. And we had a call, I think it was last Sunday morning. And there were a few of us on the call where we were just chatting and catching up. And we do like a check-in to see how everybody's doing and what they're bringing to the group. And I kind of talked about how my foot is, I'm just experiencing a lot of pain in my foot right now. In the past few weeks, it's just been excruciating. And every morning I wake up and just like hobble around my room, and it just doesn't feel like it's getting better. But I just keep delaying and putting off talking to the doctor. And I don't really know why, because I am somebody who likes to take care of themselves, and I would, I want to be able to see a doctor about what's going on with my foot. I had done some research, and I almost paid like tons of money just to go to a foot specialist because they were closer to my house. They answered the phone, but it was going to cost quite a lot of money, because even though I have the free healthcare here in London, because I paid for that, it's not free in the sense that like I prepaid for it, you could say, for my time here. If I could get in to see a doctor, it could be free, but the idea of not really knowing where to start, whereas I can just call a private clinic and just ask them for an appointment and they'll be available on Thursday, reduces so much friction that I will almost pay more to just be able to walk in on Thursday rather than having to go through this process that I'll share with you in a moment. So when after the call with the ladies, we were all talking about how, oh yes, I haven't dealt with this dental issue that I've been going through, and all I need to do is just call and make an appointment and this and that. And so all of us kind of challenged each other to like make the call this week that we will make sure that we get some appointment in. And at the end of the day, the next day, actually, I did call the doctor's office, and I was able to talk to someone at reception, and they said, so if you want to make an appointment, you first need to have a phone appointment with the doctor before you could even come in if you wanted to, as like a triage time, they were calling it. So they said, can you call us back again between the hours of 4 and 6 of that same day or whatever? So I did call them back between 4 and 6, and I was in a queue where I was the 15th caller. And like, I just felt a bit like sad, I guess, because I don't know how long each of those 15 people before me are going to take to talk about their medical issue with the doctor. And so I don't want to sit there in limbo for 15 people before me, or 14, you could say, before me, to maybe wait all that time, and then by the time it's my turn, it's actually 6 o'clock now, and they're done taking their calls for that day, and I have to wait and call again tomorrow. And so just the like stress and the frustration around all of it. I know it doesn't sound like that, like first world problems or whatever, of at least I have access to medical care, and at least I have a phone to call, and there's all of these things that I can be grateful for, and I am. However, for this process, I believe that it could be easier and better for me as the person who has the issue. And I think that we can all learn from this process as well. And I'm nearly going to move to a different virtual GP just to have faster, better, not better necessarily. I'm sure that all of the doctors there are amazing. And, I've only had to really use the service maybe once before, but the point being that I'm thinking about switching providers of services, because the process, even just to talk and get something started, who knows even what on the call, what they'll say, whether I'll be able to come in another week or 2 weeks or whatever later. But I have a pain right now. So it's just really interesting. I just feel like this whole idea of client intake, the user experience, friction and resistance, it took a lot for me to overcome my own fears, just to call them to ask what the process was, and time out of my own day to figure that out. And obviously they're trying to do me a service to help me with my issues or whatever, but just the process, I feel, for somebody who's in pain could be better. I know they also have a patches thing, but I just feel like from their website and from the process, it didn't seem very clear what it was I had to do if I wanted to talk to a doctor, even though that's essentially at the end of the day what I, as the user and the consumer of the services, wants to do. So it's no disrespect to that particular practice. It's just that for somebody who thinks about this a lot, it was quite annoying to feel like, as a user of their website, as a user of their services, that it wasn't clear like what steps to go through. And also, once I was going through that system, I didn't think or feel that I was being like taken care of as a person. So I think that's something that can be improved upon, and we can think about sort of as we think about building our own websites and applications and the way that people work through our own tools and systems. So let's talk a little bit more about this in more depth from this perspective of if you're building a Gabble workflow. So I wanted to highlight a couple of different question types and the pros and cons of each type, and from the perspective of a user experience. And keep in mind that I'm using a desktop for this example. So you'd also want to test this experience on a laptop, on a tablet and a phone, to see how the user's experience is in that process. So during my time as a no-code, low-code developer, specifically a Gabble expert, I had fun seeing how different lawyers that I was doing automations for liked to build their tools out. So everyone had their own preferences as far as how variables were used, how the layout was, how questions were worded, who it was being, who you were directing information to, how many side labels here, section progress labels there were, whether we use drop-down menus or something else, and that kind of thing. So as I've been able to start to develop my own kind of preferences around these things, a lot of my preferences come down to what the user's experience will be and how many times they have to click something in order to see the options. So for example, if we look specifically around, I'm just going to double check one thing really quick. A couple of different question types. So let me just see. So this is not going to be a conversation around the builder side of how the experience could be. So how you would necessarily set some of these things up as far as what's easier and more efficient on the builder side. It's more about what the user experience is on the live application side. So the first thing, before we talk about each different question type and why you might use one or the other in this type of block of questions I'm going to talk about, is around language. So in this particular example, this is not the best example because this is just a sort of a reference template. So it's just saying this is what a text question looks like, and this is but I'm not really talking to anyone. But let's say for this example where I created sort of a mock boutique law firm client intake questionnaire. And even from my perspective now, I think there are too many side labels or progress labels. But so maybe in the future, I would change how I did this now as I kind of continue to grow as a builder. I would change this and put copyright infringement under the copyright section, and I would have trademark infringement under the trademark section. Maybe I would keep welcome, and maybe I would keep your information. Maybe under here, though, I would put matter description and other parties kind of in the same section, which would be something like matter information. So just kind of keeping in mind that I'm also learning as I go through this process. But one of the first things that I always talk to my students about, either from being Gabble's Global Ambassador to law schools or from my academy students at Premium Academy or the fellows during the Law Students in Legal Tech Access to Justice Fellowship, I always talk about how, like, who are we talking to? Like, who is on the other side of this application? Is it something that we're using internally in a law firm? Is it something that we're using for, like, so then the end user in that case would be someone from our team, like a paralegal or another lawyer or whatever else? Is it a someone who works at a pro bono clinic and they're interfacing with this, but they're inputting a client's information. So the client's not actually seeing it, but they are telling that person the information? Or is it the actual client? The end client is also the end user in this case. So we need to think about who is that person, like who is interacting with this particular application, and that might change how we talk to them. So in this particular case, we are using something like welcome. So we're welcoming them because this might be the first thing that they're seeing from us. And then we're saying, thank you for your interest in working with us. So we're talking in terms of like you and us and we, and if you have any questions and what type of matter would you like help with and things like that. So you can see that we're having a very conversational style of communicating with the end user. It's not cold, it's warm. It's like, hello, nice to meet you, welcome, we'd love to chat with you, that kind of a cadence and a feel and a rhythm. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for when we're talking to a client, is something that is talking directly to them. Rather than saying like, what is the client's name? What is the client's phone number? We're saying, what is your name? What is your phone number? And we know on the back end that that's the client, but they don't need to be spoken to like in some robotic way. So that is just one of the first things around this type of design and reducing that friction, because we're reducing the friction by being more colloquial and more personal. And so one quick note as well around linking emails and phone numbers. So something that I've noticed is if I click on this now, notice that it says about blank and then mail to help@boutiquelawfirm.com, but it doesn't open actually like my Gmail account. So the reason for this is generally that this is a setting in the person's like email that would need to be updated to allow for websites to produce like a to like open. I'm just going to try to find you an example of this because that one's not even showing me what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for like a little symbol here, which is makes it to where the person can open it. So let me just see if I can pull up an example. So give me 1 second. So usually there's like a little symbol around here. It's not showing up right now, but usually there's a little symbol that shows, that makes it to where somebody can enable a third-party application to open as an email that's like partially drafted. Let me just see if I can. This is it here. Sorry, I think the other one's. So it says page wants to install a service handler. So the person who is your user on the other side of the screen might not have this enabled. So right now, the default Chrome setting is to ignore anytime mail.google.com links are trying to be opened. So we can manage this by saying allow, and then it will instead open as a drafted email, or putting that person's email address into the subject line of a partially like opened, ready to go email. But for some people who don't have that enabled yet, it just opens and looks weird like this. So even if you have configured this correctly on the back end where you've made this a link, and some people have this enabled, just know that some people will open it and it will say blank and be awkward if they don't have this enabled. And so just, even though this can be a helpful thing to link, just know that not everyone will encounter an experience in the same way, which I like to reduce the number of times that's the case. But the same things kind of with phone numbers as well. So that's one tip, is to just, it's not to say never link an email, it's just to say think about like test it all the way through every time in the different ways that you do it, maybe with an incognito browser, maybe with a different profile on your page, just to see how it interacts outside of your configuration, maybe even in Safari rather than Chrome, on your phone instead of on your computer, and so on. So the second thing is around like how much information is on a single page also is a matter of resistance and friction, and like how much overwhelm you're stimulating. And so think of it as a journey. I've been watching a lot of this show called Hot Ones, where the celebrity will come on and there's a host called Sean Evans, and Sean kind of asks questions of the celebrity while the celebrity is eating hot wings, and they get progressively hotter. So it starts at 1, which is like a low classic, not very hot, all the way up to a 10, which is like the 10th wing and 10th hot sauce. That makes it to where they're crying and they're like running around the room and drinking like gallons of milk and all of this stuff. So the point is to say that you kind of want to like warm people up before you ask them 10 million questions. So the idea here is that you would keep it short and simple to begin with, and only get progressively bigger or smaller or whatever as needed for each section. So break your workflow down into sections that are digestible piece by piece, and also give people a chance to save and continue later, and to not be like halfway through this super long thing, but now they have to go and they're not sure if this saved, and now they feel like they invested all this time. And so we're constantly thinking about how can we take this huge thing that we're trying to do and break it up into digestible pieces that don't look too long on a desktop, a tablet, and a mobile device. So in this particular case, we just want to start with something simple: a welcome, a hello, a little bit of information about how to get in touch with us. And then one simple question is, which type of matter would you like help with? Copyright, trademark, or patent law? Now, when it comes to this particular workflow, I understand that this is an intellectual property, a fake one, but an intellectual property firm. So some people might come to them knowing or thinking that they do patent law. In this case, I'm going to take them to a kickout page saying that we don't do patent cases, but that there's another better in this type of case solution to doing this, which would be to just have a notice here that says we only specifically focus on copyright and trademark matters. We don't do patent matters. And then you don't have to have this and have them waste their time in going through this anyway. But if you have the drop down or single select or combo box or whatever question type here, then you're able to add on sort of later. Instead of going straight into the questions, you want to direct people based on their answers. Even if you maybe only had one line of or area of practice right now, let's say copyright law, then you want to open yourself up to doing like trademarks later and maybe patents later or whatever else, or even subsets of this particular type of practice. But it makes it to where there's like places to go, if that makes sense, rather than like everything being built out as if this is the end all be all of your practice and you haven't given yourself an opening for like development. So in that's just to say, to consider that as well. But I usually like to have the first question be something that can knock people out early. So making it to where we can let people know as soon as possible before we ask anything that's not relevant to them, that may not be relevant to them. We want to be able to direct them out to other resources if we're not the right people for them to talk to. So that's something that is helpful for the person who is the user, because that's an instant decision. So if they come in and they say, oh, I want to work on a patent matter, it would be easier and better if we just told them right away that we don't do those matters at all, so they can just go on with their day, or they just wouldn't see it from the drop down. But in this particular case, I was just trying to make this point. But that if they choose copyright or trademark, they're taken just to the information that's relevant to them. So copyright registration or infringement versus trademark matters, which are like trademark registration or trademark infringement, for example, which each have their own sets of questions that they would want to have answered. So the other thing I wanted to point is a matter of question types, and to visually show you how these are different, and also tactically how these things are different. So in the case of, and this is why I like a master reference template, is so you can easily like look and see what these look like in relative to each other. So in this particular case, we're going to compare a drop-down menu, which can look really clean across all devices because it's just a bar that you would then click and then you would see what the options are, versus a combo box. So this is our drop-down question here versus a combo box, which is done here, which allows your user to type in their own option or to choose like a drop down. So it's a combination of a text question and a drop down question. And this is good for not having on the builder side to add another question of, let's say, for example, having an other and then having something open up that says which other thing. You can just have that be in one question. So that's kind of that lean design. But notice, one difference between these two from a user experience is how many times they click and where. So on the desktop, for example, you would be able to choose anywhere on this drop down. So anywhere you click on here is going to open up this drop down menu. However, if you click into a combo box question, you have to slide over to the arrow to see the choices, or you need to start typing. So physically, you have to do more work if you're going to use a combo box question, which could be worth it if you want to type in your own option. But it could be less useful if it's not something that people would generally need to put their own answer in for. So this isn't very good, I think, in the case of something that's very like one of these, for example, like it's going to be one of these things. They're not going to put in one of their own answers. And also from a builder standpoint, anything that's an open-ended sort of thing that you can't know the answer in advance makes it harder to attach logic to things as you're going through the rest of your workflow. So meaning if I had a combo box question in place of this question drop down option, it could be a real mess because I'm trying to direct someone through a useful set of questions to get them to their destination that I'm an expert in. So I want them to choose from one of these things. So I don't necessarily want to use a combo box in this particular section because I need to know this information very specifically to direct them where I need them to go. And if they just type in anything that I don't know what they're going to say, then I'm not going to be able to direct them where I need them to go to answer their questions. So, like I said, from a user experience perspective, dropdowns are nice in the sense that they're very clean and they're not overwhelming when you first encounter them, and they can open up nicely afterwards. So aesthetically, they're very pleasing in the sense that they are unobtrusive. They do require more clicks though. So instead of having a one click, because you can see all of the options, such as in a single select choice here, where the options are laid out in front of me already, they're not hidden, then I can just click once and choose something because I can see everything there versus clicking on the drop down to open it and then going down. So in my opinion, if you're going to think about the user experience from this perspective, think about, I mean, it's 2 clicks to 1 is not super crazy, but thinking about, for example, how many of the choices there are. So if it's like a really long list, let's say states, which are like 50 states, or countries in the world, or something that's like super, super long, you probably don't want to have that be a single select question type. You would probably prefer that to be something like a drop down like this, or even a CSV question, which looks like this, where the person can type in something that will bring up a result that's really clean as well. Notice the difference between a CSV question that we had here and the dropdown, for example, is that the dropdown will show you all of the answers as soon as you click on them, whereas the CSV question requires you to type something in first to see the answers that have that letter or combination of letters in them. So if you notice, I say B only shows up Brittany Hernandez. If I say D, I can see Brittany and Demi. So I don't know from the beginning as the user what options are available. So this is better for somebody who knows exactly what's in the CSV itself. So, or something very standard for how somebody would search for it. So you don't want it to be something that somebody would have to like kind of guess it. So if the question is, what state do you live in within the United States? Somebody can start typing in California, or like even if they just say CA, or if they say California, in either case, that's going to show up, because if you have like the state names in full and then their abbreviations, and maybe they're abbreviations where there's 3 letters and there are abbreviations where there's 2 letters and the full name. So where you have that CSV be searchable by state, full name, 2 letters and 3 letters, then in any case, in combination, somebody would be able to find their state that way. So just thinking about the user experience, thinking about what's going to be better for them, and also on your builder side, what's going to allow you to attach logic to these things later on, and combine them together in, like, let's say, invisible logic. So when we talk next a little bit more about these differences between the user experience for a drop-down question, for example, versus a combo box, I'm actually very partial to the combo box just because I like the ability to both put in a text question or like an other answer, like a choice 3, and also the ability to have it function like a drop-down where you search for it here, but also the ability to have it function like a bit of a like a search bar through the choices. I like that as well. So I do like a combo box. I would say I would just like for them person to be able to click across like they do with a drop-down question, because otherwise they have to go all the way over here if they just want to see or choose from the drop-down. Not crazy or critical, a very powerful question type. So that's just to show you some of the differences from a user experience. If I'm the user and I'm on my laptop, I just have to put my cursor anywhere over this bar, click on it. It looks very clean from an aesthetic perspective. The only thing is that the answers are hidden, so I do need to click on it in order to see it. Whereas, as I mentioned, in a single select question type, they can see the choices right away, choose with only one click, and move on to the next question. Obviously, a multi-select will allow somebody to make multiple choices at once. And then you have that CSV where you would have to start typing in. So I think about, like, how many times does my user's hand have to move from where it was to initiate something to happen in this application? So does this person have to do a lot of stopping what they're doing to click and click again? And obviously, if they're taking this interview, we should hopefully have their full attention. But in the case of, like, if they're like, do they have to click, scroll, click, scroll, click, or do they have to scroll, click, scroll, type, scroll, click, click, scroll, type? Just thinking about all of these different elements of, like, how many times are they clicking, how many times are they scrolling, how many times are they typing, and how many times are they doing that on a single page? Is it too many times? And what does that look like in each environment? And is it important, or would it be helpful for them to be able to see the answers faster? So one of the ways we can do that is with default questions or default answers as well. So in the case, for example, of if you generally work for a jurisdiction where there's a county that you're very specialized in, maybe you have a question that is county related. So let's say you always have Allen county in Indiana, for example. That's always going to be, usually like 99% of the time, the people in your firm are your clients from this particular county. Then that would be a useful thing to have as a default answer. So somebody doesn't even have to click anything at all. So thinking about where we can put those different default answers throughout to make that person's journey better is always good to think about as well. So let's say, for example, let's see, I think when we think about this design as well, one of the things I want to talk about is this idea of kicking people out early. So during the Law Students and Legal Tech Access to Justice Fellowship, I taught the students how to create an eligibility for a specially adapted housing grant app. So this is something that turns a lot of information on the VA website into something a bit more interactive and easier to understand, I think, from the user's perspective. So one of the things I wanted is for someone to be able to determine very quickly whether or not they qualify for this type of grant. And so even in one click, they could get kicked out, and maybe up to 3 questions or 4 questions or whatever. So to see whether or not they qualify. So in this particular case, I went through the eligibility criteria for this app and determined how I might put these questions in a particular order to kick people out as soon as possible so that they can go on with their day and understand that they're not qualified for this particular one or not eligible, and that they can try something else or move on to another type of grant to apply for. And then also maybe at this point, we're also qualifying leads for ourselves to determine who we would want to work with, so that we can understand who our audience is and to see whether we could actually take their application forward in this case. For example, excuse me. So in this case, you wouldn't necessarily have to have like, what's your first name, last name, and email address. This was part of the class. So the reason why I put it here is that somebody could like maybe we want to have their information to be able to like follow up with more information about another type of grant, or have some different path or trigger or automation happen depending on this particular answer. But because they're going to find out so quickly, I need to ask them now versus later in the workflow, because if they say none of the above, they're going to get kicked out of the workflow. So I need to collect that information now. So that's one tip as far as like knowing and anticipating what the paths are so that you can collect the information that you need along the way. So in this case, when I was thinking about the user experience, I was thinking about also like what questions need to be required to make sure that their experience is going the way that I need them to go, down the path that I need them to go. So there's a lot of element of not really about like control, but about anticipation and expectations of like, if this happens and they click on this thing, then this thing's going to happen, and being able to direct that particular journey for them so that we can answer their questions and give them a likely outcome as soon as possible. So in this particular case, as I said, I organized the questions. So there would be 3 questions that would make it to where we can decide whether this person's eligible or not. The conditions are whether they have a service-connected disability, whether they own or will own a home, and whether they're going to use the grant money to buy, build, or change their permanent home. So there's those 3 pieces that are important here. If they say none of the above to these particular service-connected disabilities, then they're not able to get this grant because they must have one of these in order to qualify. If they don't own or will own their home, then if they're not going to own their home, then they don't qualify. So they need to have that one as well. And if they're not going to use the money to buy, build, or change their permanent home, then they can't have this grant. Only in the condition that they have a curved service-connected disability and they have they're going to use the money to buy, build, or change their home, and they own or will own their home, then they're going to be eligible. So when we think about which way this particular order is, obviously we didn't have this information at first. When I was reading through the different qualifications, I had to come up with the order of these and how this is presented to the user. So when I was considering that, if you think about this here, so we're looking just specifically at this section here. So this talks about the grant and its particular eligibility criteria. So this is that part of you may be eligible to get this if you're using the money to buy, build, or change your permanent home, and then they just define what a permanent home is, and you meet both of these requirements. So actually, even though this isn't a bullet point over here, this is a requirement, this first line, because you need this and you need to meet both of these. You will or own or will own the home, and you have one of these qualifying disabilities, which are delineated here. So taking this and rearranging it a little bit and making it interactive makes it to where we can tell someone in one click if they don't qualify. So I can just say here, for example, Brittany Hernandez, and I can put in my email address and I can say continue, and I'm going to get kicked out, and they're going to say, sorry, you can only qualify for this if you have one of the listed qualifying services connected disabilities. You may be eligible for other grants. Please refer to this link here or page for more information. Sorry. So if I say continue, then I'm going to go to the end, and then that's it. If I go back and I change my answer to one of these other options, so literally any of these other options, because any of these will do, and I can see some more information here about this particular type of grant. If I go continue now, I'm going to see another question. And you can see it's very digestible as well. So one question at a time is not necessarily like the rule of thumb, but just that like how it looks on the page is important, because you don't want to overwhelm somebody with a huge list of questions that all show at the same time. So in this particular case, I have some hidden blocks on the back of the editor that makes it to where only this question is showing right now, because this is a determining question. Will you be using the grant money to buy, build, or change your permanent home, where a permanent home is a home you plan to live in for a long time? So if they say no, they get an immediate answer. Sorry, you need to use the grant money to do this in order to qualify. And then they continue to the end, and then we get thank you. If they say yes, they're going to see a different message, which is a new last question. Do you own or will you own the home? Because that is one of our requirements. If they say no, they get an immediate answer. Sorry, you need to either own or be in a position to own the home in the future in order to qualify for this grant. They continue and they're out. If they say yes, that's their last question. They continue and they're given, you may be eligible. Here's how to apply. So you can see that each of these 3 points, this one here and these two here, including all of these different qualifying service-connected disabilities, have been accounted for in 3 questions. So that's the type of design thinking that we're talking about, is we're taking this information here, we're digesting it, understanding how these relate to each other, and turning it into something that a user can interact with very quickly and in a more like digestible, interactive format. And maybe this also makes it to where we're qualifying our leads for ourselves through our business. So if somebody is eligible, maybe we want one automation to fire that makes it to where we then are able to follow up with them. They can book a meeting with us and we can help them with their application. Maybe the person who says none of the above gets a different message at the end, or we just let this be what it is. It depends on what you're trying to use it for. So that's an example of some different ways that we can create some frictionless or less resistance kind of oriented workflows using different question types, particularly in the Gabble platform. And like I said, I would probably go back and update these to have less section labels, because sometimes, especially when you're on a mobile device, this can look really overwhelming because they all get pushed to the top like this when it gets squished. So you don't want like 1 million pieces of information at the top of the phone and section where you have to scroll all the way down just to get to the beginning, which could get confusing. So just think about that when you're considering your user journey as well. So this has been a discussion of reducing friction, lessons learned from Atomic Habits for improving the user experience. So one last point I wanted to make here is on the fact that one of the points he makes in Atomic Habits is this kind of, I think this is the third. So there's the 4 rules, 4 laws of behavior change, which is make it obvious, make it easy, make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. That might be in a different order, but the idea here is that so make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. So it's the third law of behavior change is make it easy. So remember this, that energy is precious and the brain is wired to conserve it whenever possible, even if we're just talking about a split second. So I'll leave you with a final example here, which I thought was really good around something that I heard, which might have been in something like, it's something about like willpower. It's something about like, I can't remember the title of this book, but it's around willpower and the idea that you can design an environment that takes into consideration this idea of the law of least effort, and you can design even, let's say, a cafeteria or an office to make it to where people make healthier choices by default, just because it's the easier option. So that would be, for example, putting the sodas all the way in the back of a store rather than right at the front next to the checkout. So people would be actually drinking more water just because they are grabbing it right before they check out versus having to walk all the way back to where they were before and forgot and have to go all the way back. And in one story that was told, it was around like health in a particular office, and they were trying to just design a better way to also save money on M&Ms, because they had this jar of M&Ms on the reception counter with the lid open. People would just grab some and go about their day. So they were eating and consuming like $700 worth of bags of M&Ms per year or something. So they just did one simple thing that changed this. They put the lid on the M&M jar, and it was this one small act of having to take the lid off and then grab it and then put the lid back on that made it to where they were able to reduce the M&M intake and consumption throughout the office by whatever percentage. So it's really interesting how we can take these principles of reducing friction, this idea of atomic habits, and the third law of making it easy to development, and especially in this case, no code, low code development, or development with no tools like Gavel, for example, and how these different considerations of language, how many clicks, how many questions on a page, how we're able to create leaner and tighter and more efficient workflows throughout this particular process, and leading people down a particular path that helps them to their legal solution faster, can really be applied. So that is just to say, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. I'll give you my information in a moment, but I hope this was useful. A few quick announcements. So I do this show every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. I also come out with Code Word Hex with new issues every Tuesday. Tuesday Forecast Newsletter also comes out every Tuesday. We also have certification courses in Gavel and Software and Airtable and Go Full Page, with more to come at Chromium Academy. We have the Chromium Global Community. So if you sign up for any of our courses, you can get added to that community. And there's also a very active Slack group within the Gavel community as well. So thank you so much for being here. Those of you that are with me live, and those of you that are watching on the recording, hello. And next week, we're going to be here on the 12th of July at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to be discussing a place and time for worries to go, and it's not here or now. And that's featuring morning pages from The Artist's Way. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or by email at brittany@chromium.pro. And for any inquiries relating to Gavel's law school program, please email me at brittany@gavel.io. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you all next time. Bye, everybody.